Alright, so let's get going on today's class. So today we're going to start our look at chapter 3, which is when we're going to get into one of the first chapters where we take a look at the basics of procedures of learning, the basics of two phenomena of learning, specifically elicited behavior and one of the major forms of learning we're going to take a look at, which is classical conditioning. Now, before we get to that, we got to wrap up just a little bit on research methods that we introduced, that we almost finished last time. So we need to take a look at that single subject design, to take a look at the right way to tackle that rather than the wrong way, which is what we introduced last time. So last time we left off, we were taking a look at how do you test a treatment. If you develop a treatment, this is especially important if you're going into clinical psychology. If you develop a treatment for your client, how do you know that that treatment is effective? And the intuitive thing is to say, well, you just measure them before the treatment, you measure them after the treatment, and if it changes their behavior, treatment is effective. But as we saw, that's the single comparison design, where you have a baseline, you observe how bad their behavior is, and then you institute the treatment and you see if there's a change in their behavior. So the baseline is referred to as A for baseline, and the treatment is referred to as B. And you're probably thinking, why not B for baseline? Well, because A is baseline, clearly. So anyway, A is baseline, B is the treatment condition. And in a single comparison design, you do baseline first and then treatment. And as we discussed last time, the problem with this design is if you do see a change in behavior. So if we're trying to stop somebody's smoking habit, we have the number of cigarettes smoked here. This is across the days during the baseline phase. And we can see that the amount of cigarettes that this individual smoked in the baseline phase went down after the treatment phase was begun. And in this case, the treatment phase would be tearing up a $5 bill every time they smoked a cigarette. As we discussed last time, this change might be due to the treatment, which would be, yay, this is exactly what we want. On the other hand, it could be due to something else. It could be due to a new romantic relationship. It could be due to the in-laws' surprise visit. It could be due to surgery. They're in the hospital. It could be due to they lost their job and they have to cut back. It could be due to any number of things that are not the treatment, in which case it would be irresponsible and unethical of us as psychologists to say, hey, my treatment is effective, keep doing this, and you will improve your behavior. So we need methods to make sure that this decrease was caused by our treatment, and one of the ways to do that is called the reversal design. So the reversal design, an ABA, or if you find out your treatment is successful, ABAB design, is where you start off with a baseline period, then you institute a treatment period, and then you reverse the treatment. You go back to baseline and see what happens. And it's that going back to baseline and seeing what happens that lets you know, was it the treatment or was it something else? So let's take a look at this for our smoking example. So once again, a person comes in, they say that they want to stop smoking. First thing you do is for 1 week, you just tell them, track how much you smoke. Just a regular, just smoke your regular amounts, and let's see what level the behavior is. So that's the baseline phase, that comes before the treatment. This dotted line is when the treatment begins, and you tell them, now for every cigarette you smoke, take a $5 bill, rip it in half. That's going to be the treatment, and we find that once we institute that treatment, their behavior decreases. They smoke fewer cigarettes during that treatment phase. Again, we're left with the possibility, maybe due to the treatment, maybe due to something else. So what we do is we eliminate the possibility that it's something else, or we investigate the possibility that it's something else by going through another baseline period. So at the end of this treatment week, the person comes back and we say, all right, what I want you to do for the next week is stop ripping up $5 bills. Go back to smoking whenever you want, and no ripping up $5 bills for the rest of the week. So you go back to baseline and you see what happens. If the behavior goes back to baseline levels, that is evidence that it was your treatment that was causing the change, not some other factors. And basically what it's doing is it's lining up coincidence after coincidence after coincidence to make it very likely that this change was due to your treatment. Because what are the odds that they met somebody who didn't like smoking at the end of the first week, and then they just happened to break up with them at the beginning of the second treatment? And sometimes in very important treatments, you'll go A, B, A, B, A, B. You'll reverse it a few times. So if you reverse it again, what are the odds that that person came back? And then the next week they break up again. And then a week later they come back, right? So it's basically just heaping coincidence on top of coincidence to the point where it becomes so unlikely that anything else is continually coinciding with these on-again, off-again treatment phases that it has to be the treatment that is causing that change in behavior. So this pattern here, where the baseline phase brings the behavior back to the original baseline phase, that's strong evidence that it's your treatment that caused this change in behavior, at which point, on week 4, you would say, you know what, looks like the treatment is effective. This is what I want you to do for the rest of your life. Keep $5 bills in your pocket whenever you want to smoke, rip up a $5 bill, and that treatment will be instituted, and their behavior, because we now know that it's effective, will gradually go down and down and down. So that's the pattern of behavior that indicates that it was your treatment that caused the desire for change. However, it is possible that you do your baseline phase, institute your treatment phase, and then you go back to baseline, right? So you go back to that reversal and you say, all right, for this period here, I don't want you tearing up $5 bills, just smoke as much as you want. And they come back and it turns out that their smoking stayed low. So this, because we did not return back to baseline levels, because the behavior remained changed even after the treatment was removed, because remember, they're not ripping up $5 bills here, this is an indication that it wasn't your treatment that caused the desired change. So as a psychologist, number one, you wouldn't return to treatment because your treatment is ineffective. Number two, you would start investigating and asking them, hey, what happened right about here? So that you can find what is motivating their change and develop a treatment based on that. So if they say something like, oh, well, I met somebody and they don't like smokers, you might say, all right, well, maybe like a self-improvement program will be better for this individual. Maybe, a makeover, make yourself more attractive to, potential partners will work for this person. But it basically tells you this, pattern tells you your treatment didn't cause the change. It was something else. And then as a psychologist, you investigate and you try to find out what that something else is. All right, any questions on the reversal procedure? All right, so sometimes, oftentimes a reversal procedure is used. Sometimes you can't use a reversal procedure, right? So sometimes there's certain treatments that cannot be reversed. One of the classic ones for changing behavior, when you do surgery, brain surgery for epilepsy, where you remove the part of the brain that is causing the epileptic seizures, that is a single subject treatment, but you can't put the brain back in to see if the epilepsy seizures come back. But you still want to know if the treatment was successful. So sometimes you cannot reverse the treatment. Sometimes it's unethical to reverse the treatment. So occasionally, if the subject is a harm to themselves or could be dangerous to others, you wouldn't want to reverse the treatment. But at the same time, you still need to know, is it the treatment that did it, or is it some other factor? So in these cases, you can use another technique called the multiple baseline design. And the multiple baseline design is when you institute a treatment for multiple kind of phenomenon at different baselines. So the phenomenon can be either persons. So this one is multiple baselines across different people. So this would be if you have a very small number of subjects, like 3 or 4, you could use this procedure. But if we're going to stick to the single subject design, you can also use the multiple baseline across settings to determine if your treatment is effective, or multiple baseline across behaviors, and use the fact that behaviors are oftentimes concurrent. Bad behaviors are oftentimes concurrent. I know very few people where if you ask them, is there any behavior that you wish you did less of, or is there anything about yourself that you wish you could change? And they're like, you know what? Yes, but only one thing. Other than that, I'm perfect. If I could just change this one thing, I would be 100% perfect. Most people have a few things that they want to work on. So you can take advantage of that as a psychologist, and you can say, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to change the behaviors, but we're going to change them across different baselines for different situations. So we'll start off with the one across persons, so multiple baselines across people. So we'll go back to the cigarettes smoke, and let's say that you just happen to have 3 clients, and these 3 clients all want you to help them with their smoking habit. What you can do is you can say to that first client, person A, you can say, all right, you're going to come back in a week. So I want you to smoke as much as you normally do for that week, and we'll keep track of it. And then when you come back, we will start your treatment where you're ripping up $5 bills every time you smoke a cigarette. And you can see that we have the baseline here, we have the treatment here. Treatment is lower than the baseline condition. Looks like the treatment is effective. Maybe something happened right at that moment right there when the treatment began that causes change in behavior. But let's say we don't want to reverse the treatment. What we can do is, if we have a second client, person B, we can say, all right, what we're gonna do is you're gonna stay on this baseline for 2 weeks, and then we're gonna start your treatment after 2 weeks, and their treatment is the same, and it causes a decrease in the behavior. And then for person C here, they go on a 3-week baseline, and then their treatment begins, and again, their treatment leads to lower amounts of smoking. In this case, we use multiple baselines. And again, it's that idea of stacking coincidences on top of coincidences. Because the chance that this person here may have met somebody who doesn't like smoking on this occasion here, that's possible, right? That's plausible. Maybe that could occur. But the chance that person A met somebody who doesn't like smoking after 7 days, and it just happens that person B met somebody that doesn't like smoking after 14 days, and then it just happens that person C meets somebody who doesn't like smoking after 21 days. Unless this person is hanging outside of the clinic and really likes, people that are going through therapy, like that's their type. It's not going to happen, right? It's a highly coincidental occurrence. So meeting 3 people that don't like smoking, in-laws just happen to visit them on those separate days, right? And the multiple baseline takes care of any sort of societal thing that's happening. So if you started everybody's baseline on July 4th, right, the July 4th weekend, it's quite plausible that maybe they'll all get surprise guests on that, on that weekend. But if you start one on July 4th, the next one's on July 11th, the next one's on July 18th, what are the odds that on those particular weeks, that's when people come by? So this is taking advantage of the fact, again, that you're piling coincidences on top of coincidences, and the treatment only goes down after you, the behavior only goes down after you start the treatment for each individual. Now this one I always find a little bit cheating, because this is supposed to be single subject designs. So to say, well, solve the problem by using multiple subjects, is kind of like, it seems cheating. So let's take a look at one where you're actually using a single subject. What can you do in that case? Well, one thing that you can do is you can do it behavior across different settings. So what you can do is you can tell your client, what you're going to do for the first week is you're going to smoke as much as you want, anywhere that you smoke. Anywhere you normally smoke, you smoke as much as you want. That establishes a baseline. After that first week, you tell them, all right, what we're going to do now is we're going to do a multiple baseline across settings. And in your home, if you're at home and you're smoking, rip up a $5 bill. But anywhere else, any other setting, you can smoke as much as you want. And we can see here that smoking goes down in the home, but it doesn't go down in any other setting. And then what you can do is you can say after 2 weeks, after the second baseline, you can say, you know what, now, anytime you're at home and anytime you're at work, if you want to smoke, rip up a $5 bill. And now we see that it goes down in the work setting, but not in this third setting. The third setting, the smoking stays high. And then in the third week, we'll say, all right, now anytime that you're out in a social situation, not at home, not at work, you're out about in town, and you want a cigarette, tear up a $5 bill, and now it goes down in this particular setting. The fact that it only went down in each setting when you started the treatment in that setting is again very good evidence that it's your treatment that's causing the desire for change in behavior. Because if it was something else, it might have occurred in the home, it might have occurred at work, it might have occurred in social situations at any of these times. So when you only see the drop after the treatment is started in that particular setting, and you don't see a drop anywhere else, that decreases the chance that it's that something else that is changing the desired for behavior. So that's multiple baseline across settings. And then the final one is multiple baselines across behaviors. And this, again, takes advantage of the fact that usually people have multiple behaviors that they might want to change. So if you have, if you're a developmental psychologist and a parent brings in a child, and the parent says, my child needs, needs to learn some self-control, they probably have self-control across a lot of behaviors that they need to develop. So you might say, all right, first thing we're going to do is we're going to stop the faces, right? So first thing we're going to treat is we're going to treat the faces. So maybe you tell the parent, put them in timeout for 3 minutes every single time they make a face, but you leave the nail biting alone and you leave the nose picking alone, and you track how much faces are they making, how much nose picking, how much nail biting. And if the faces goes down after the treatment for faces begins, but the nail biting stays high, the nose picking stays high, that's evidence that it's your treatment, it's not something else. Then you institute the treatment for the nail biting. And if it's only the nail biting that goes down at that time, remember, you're still treating the faces, but now you're treating the nail biting, but the nose picking remains high. That gets rid of the possibilities that it's maturational changes in this child. That gets rid of the possibilities that something at school happened, that other factors might have caused these changes in behavior. Because it's only happening specifically for the behavior you're treating, when you're treating that behavior, that again is very good evidence that it's your treatment and not the any other changes in this child's life that is causing that behavior. And then finally, after the last baseline, you institute the timeout procedure for nose picking, and if that goes down, you can be confident that yes, it's this timeout treatment that is doing it, and no, it's not something else that happened in this child's life. All right, any questions on that? All right. So we're going to move into chapter 3 right now. And in chapter 3, we're going to start off with some very basic forms of learning. And we're going to apply it to try to answer two kind of weird phenomenon that you probably experience. So the first one we're going to take a look at is what is known as the cocktail party effect. And this is an effect where you're in a crowd of people. And when you're in a crowd of people, you can usually carry on a conversation with people around you by zoning in your attention on this conversation. So you can still hear people in the background, but it's as if you've muted the conversation in the background and you've turned up the volume on your own conversation. So you can talk to somebody in a very crowded, noisy place and pay attention to their conversation. However, as soon as somebody outside in the crowd around you mentions your name, your attention gets snapped away from the person you're talking to, and immediately you're very sensitive to the other conversations, and you're almost eavesdropping on those other conversations. So we're going to take a look at a theory that can help to explain why is it that you can zone in on a conversation until your name is mentioned somewhere else, and then all of a sudden you're very sensitive to those other conversations. We're also going to take a look at the traditional rom-com structure. So if you've ever seen a rom-com, like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, you know that these two will not start off the movie liking each other, right? They don't start off liking each other, they hate each other, and then through a gradual kind of shenanigans and mix-em-ups, they come to love each other by the end, and they find out that they were meant for each other all along. That's basically the plot of about 98% of the rom-coms out there, right? It's always boy meets girl, they hate each other, but then in the end, they can't be without each other. And we're actually going to see that that's the plot line of about 98% of the rom-coms, because there's a psychological basis for that. It's not just made up, it's not just Hollywood hokum. There's actually a strong psychological theory that would predict that change in your relationship to people going from dislike to feelings of love. So we're going to take a look at that. We're not doing research methods, we're doing chapter 3. So we're going to start off with simple mechanisms of learning, specifically habituation and sensitization. And then, so that's going to be for the cocktail party effect, and then we're going to take a look at the rom-coms by taking a look at the opponent process theory of emotion, which helps explain how we can have intense emotional reactions to only very quickly feel completely the opposite. All right, so let's start off with the simple mechanisms of learning. Habituation is the first one we'll look at. And habituation is where you have a decrease in the strength of an elicited behavior after repeated presentations of that eliciting stimulus. So an elicited behavior, you can kind of think of it almost as like an automatic behavior, kind of like as a reaction to a stimulus. Kind of like, you know, if somebody snaps their finger, you kind of immediately have your attention drawn to that place. So you can think of it in that way, and the eliciting stimulus is just a stimulus that caused that eliciting behavior. And habituation is a phenomenon where your response to that stimulus will decrease over repeated presentations. So if you have ever lived in an apartment or a house that has radiators, you'll know that radiators make sounds. But you will also get used to the sound of the radiator to the point where you will not notice them when you live in that house. That's habituation. You're exposed to the sound of the radiator day in and day out. Your body turns down its reaction to that radiator and you become habituated to it. Somebody who's visiting your house might come in and say, wow, your radiators are pretty loud. And you would say, really? I barely notice them, because you're habituated to that. Another thing we habituate to, and we might be able to catch it right now, is the sound of the fluorescent lights. They hum, they buzz, but you don't usually notice them. And let's see if we can actually hear some. They're making noise. But until I pointed it out, how many of you were sitting here thinking, man, those fluorescent lights are making so much noise? You habituate to it. You barely even notice it because it's being repeatedly presented. So your response to it, your noticing of it, your hearing of it goes down and down and down. I'll give you another example of habituation, and this is for babies crying. This is only for experienced parents. So any parent knows that on their first child, and I went through this myself, that cry is just, you get this elicited behavior of, you've got to go, check it out. So when a baby cries, I remember feeling anxious and I had to go and, oh my gosh, what's going on? What's up? What's this? What's that? Is she okay? Does she need anything? Is everything fine? After repeated presentations of the baby crying, your response goes down. It goes down to the point where you're like, baby's crying, all right, let's see what she needs. Where you're not agitated, you're not like in danger mode, because you've had repeated presentations of it, you've habituated to it. One more example, the clothes that you wear. You habituate to the clothes that you wear. So now that I mention it, if I tell you, think about the pants you're wearing. Where are they tight? Where are they loose? Right now you can say, you're not numb down there. You can say, oh yeah, it's kind of tight here, it's kind of loose here. What about the shirt that you're wearing? Does it kind of bunch up in certain areas? Is it, is it kind of heavy? You're probably all noticing your clothes right now. Not until I mentioned it, because it's continually being presented to you as a stimulus, you habituate to it. You don't notice it. All right, so that's habituation. Habituation has an opposite process, a flip side to it, and that is called sensitization. And sensitization, like I said, is the opposite of habituation. That's where, through repeated presentations of a stimulus, your response actually increases. So your elicited behavior gets stronger, gets more intense, the more you're exposed to a particular stimulus. So if you have ever lived next to loud neighbors, or if construction has ever gone on right outside of your home, nope, not the tap. If construction has ever gone on right outside of your home, you might become sensitized to that sound. On the first day, maybe you can handle it. On the second day, you start to get very aggravated, and on the third day, you can't stand it anymore because the noise hasn't gotten any louder, but your response to it has been sensitized. Your response to it has increased in its magnitude. If you've ever tried to fall asleep at night and there's a dripping faucet, that sound starts off like drip, 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 but then eventually it's like drip, 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 and you just can't fall asleep. Because the repeated presentation, it's not like the water has gotten any larger or louder, it's just that your response to it, your elicited behavior has increased due to sensitization. And this also, you'll see this occasionally, once again, let's go back to children. You might see this in a supermarket where parents are ignoring their children's requests. So their child is like pulling on their leg because they want a chocolate bar, and they're like, dad, 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 right? Repeated stimulus. The child's not getting any louder, but maybe in the dad's mind it's like dad, 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 to the point where the dad's like, what? What is it that you want? What do you want? Child hasn't gotten any louder. Your response to it has increased due to sensitization. So we have sensitization where you get repeated presentations and your response goes up. We got habituation where you got repeated presentations and your response goes down. So a question might be, well, when does a repeated presentation lead to sensitization? And when does it lead to habituation? Because it's the same thing. Sometimes it leads to an increase in the signal, sometimes it leads to a decrease. What are some of the characteristics that will let you know if a stimulus will result in habituation or will result in sensitization? All right, so a stimulus is going to result in habituation if it's and this is typically, right, so this doesn't cover, none of these are 100%, but typically, if the stimulus is a low intensity stimulus, it will lead to habituation. So things like the hissing of a radiator, things like the fluorescent lights that are very low intensity, those will habituate and you'll be able to, your response to those will decrease. On the other hand, a high intensity stimulus will tend to sensitize. It'll tend to go through sensitization. So loud noises, right? Construction outside, your neighbor playing music that's way too loud. Those are stimuli that you will sensitize to. Your response to them will increase over time. So the first kind of predictor of whether something's going to be habituation or sensitization, if it's low intensity, habituation, if it's high intensity, sensitization. And interestingly, if it's in between, if it's intermediate in its intensity, those ones begin with sensitization, and then eventually they move to habituation. So first you go through a process of sensitization, and then you go through a process of habituation. So once again, let's take a look at the parents. So the parents who are on their first child, who haven't gone through very many repeated presentations of this child, for example, at the supermarket, they're the ones who are at the supermarket when their child is on their leg going dad, 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 dad. That stimulus is going to them, dad, 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 right? They're getting sensitized. On the other hand, people on their fourth or fifth child, when their little child is in the supermarket going dad, 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 to them it sounds more like dad, dad, dad. And they're the ones that'll walk around the entire supermarket and they don't even, they're not bothered by it because it's an intermediate intensity stimulus, right? The child's not very loud, it's not very soft, not very loud, it's right in the middle. In the beginning, you get sensitized to those. It seems like the child's getting louder. Later on, you then habituate to those seems like the child is not as loud. Your response is not as much. All right, so we have intensity, kind of predicting whether we're going to go through habituation or sensitization. Another factor that determines habituation or sensitization is whether the stimulus is irrelevant or whether the stimulus gives you information. Right? So is it irrelevant or is it relevant? And a classic example of an irrelevant stimulus is your clothes. Now, what I mean by irrelevant isn't that you can do without this. So don't come into school without your clothes on. Your clothes are not irrelevant to society. But what I mean is that the stimulus of your clothes doesn't provide you with any useful information. Right? So you don't have to constantly check on your clothes to make sure that they're there. Right? You've never been in a situation where you're outside of a room and you're wearing your shirt and pants. And then as soon as you walk inside of the room, you're like, oh my gosh, my pants and my shirt are gone. Right? We don't live in that universe. So this feeling on our body of our clothes, it's irrelevant. We can't use that information. If we lived in a world where our clothing spontaneously disappeared, it would be a very relevant stimulus, right? We would have to check in every once in a while and say, do I still have a shirt? Oh, thank goodness I still have a shirt. But we don't live in that world. So we don't have to constantly check in on our clothes. So all this signal, all this stimulus that our clothes are sending us, we have no use for it, irrelevant stimulus. We habituate to it. We notice it less and less and less. If, on the other hand, it's a relevant stimulus, you will notice it more and more and more. So a relevant stimulus would be something like the buzz of a wasp. So this is a very relevant stimulus. If you're outside, if you hear a wasp buzzing, then you're in danger of getting stung. If you don't hear a wasp buzzing, then you're in no danger of getting stung. So whether you hear the buzz or whether you don't hear the buzz, that is an important piece of information. That matters to your behavior. So for a buzzing of a wasp, you cannot ignore that. And if you've ever been trying to fall asleep in a room where there's a mosquito, you'll be going through the same thing. You will hear that mosquito, and it will seem to be much louder than it is because it's a relevant stimulus. It gives you information that you can use. It gives you information that's important for your behavior. All right, so any questions on this so far? All right, so let's apply this to the cocktail effect. So in the cocktail effect, one of the possible explanations for this is because of the classification of the stimuli as being either relevant or being irrelevant. So a behavior or a stimulus that is relevant is the conversation that you're having with your friend. Right, so the conversation that you're focusing on when your friend is telling you about the great thing that happened at work, and you're telling them about the wonderful time you had at school. This is relevant to you and your friend because you care about each other. You're interested. How was your day? I want to know more about you, and you're interacting with them. So that's relevant. Everything else that is occurring around you is irrelevant. Right? So you don't care who bought a new boat, you don't care who just improved their golf game, you don't know these people, it's not relevant to your situation, so you can habituate to it. So you sensitize to the important conversation that you have, and you habituate to all the unimportant conversations because they're all irrelevant stimuli. But what is something that can make those irrelevant conversations very relevant? Your name. Because as soon as somebody in that crowd says Igor, chances are they're talking about me. But as soon as they say that, all of a sudden that conversation becomes very relevant to you. It's very important to you. We live in a society where we want to know what other people are saying about us. We want to know if there's somebody talking about us. So once that occurs, this irrelevant conversation that you were able to habituate to actually becomes highly relevant. And now you are sensitized to that conversation, and it actually becomes very difficult to maintain concentration on the conversation that you have, and you can't help but find yourself kind of listening into what's going on in that other conversation. So this is one possible explanation for this cocktail effect, and it all has to do with these basic principles of habituation and sensitization. So as long as it's irrelevant, the volume on those outside conversations seems to go down. Once it becomes relevant, then all of a sudden the volume on that outside conversation skyrockets, and you start getting sensitized to that stimulus. All right, any questions on sensitization, habituation, those basic learning processes? All right. So the last thing we're going to cover today is the opponent process theory of emotion. And this was a theory of emotion that uses habituation-like processes and sensitization-like processes. That's why we're tackling it in the same class. But this was a theory that tried to explain the after effects of strong emotional responses. So it seemed that when you had a very strong emotional response, immediately afterwards, you would have a opposite emotion. You would feel very opposite to that particular response. So if you've ever done something that was like a complete adrenaline rush, it was very, very scary, right? Let's say you go skydiving, for example. That's a typical example. When you go skydiving, you're in the plane, and because of the way that humans often think, we often think of the worst outcomes. And we're sitting there going, what if my chute doesn't open? What if I just slam into the ground? I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. You're afraid, right? You have a very high level of fear. Once you skydive and you hit to the ground, that fear is gone. And you don't go back to feeling normal. You all of a sudden feel indestructible, right? You all of a sudden feel fearless. So you finish that skydiving thing, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've never felt so powerful in my life. I'm going to go into work. I'm going to ask for that raise. I'm going to, break up with that horrible relationship that I'm in. I can do anything. I'm going to call out my bully from high school. I'm going to punch him in the face. Like you feel completely fearless. Why? Why did you go from being completely afraid to feeling completely fearless? Why do people who win the lottery and have this great happiness after learning that they won the lottery oftentimes go through a period of profound sadness after winning the lottery? Why these opposite emotions often occur, that was what the opponent process theory of emotion was trying to explain. And that's actually what we're going to use to try to explain why the typical structure of the rom-com is not crazy. It's not made up. It actually has a basis in psychological theory. It can actually be explained by this opponent process theory of emotion. Now, before we get to that, I just want to put just a little aside to some of the work that I do. So one of the projects that I work on is in visual language and the use of metaphors and different structures in visual language. And I just wanted to point out that this structure here of the back-to-back characters, that is something that is used oftentimes to communicate the idea that these two people are not going to get along. They're going to bicker, they're going to fight. they're not going to get along at some point. And if you start taking a look at a lot of these romantic comedy posters, you'll see that many of them communicate this idea using this back-to-back structure. So a lot of these, you know, it's just a used thing. There was actually articles written about the fact that Matthew McConaughey can't stand up on his own when he was doing rom-coms because there's just so many when he's leaning on somebody else. But they don't even have to be leaning on each other. They will still be back-to-back. And this is actually something that is also seen across cultures. So it's not even like, oh, we learn in North America, this is what this means. This is actually just, it seems to be one of those metaphors that is shared across cultures. Anyway, that's just a little aside, back to McConaughey. And does anybody remember the time he was doing nothing but rom-coms? There was like a period in his career after, I think it was Sahara, it was his big action movie flop, where he was just like, I gotta pay the mortgage, I gotta pay some bills, and he was just did rom-coms all over the place. Anyways, that's back to the point at hand. So, we're going to take a look at this, and again, the opponent process theories of emotion, they use habituation-like processes and sensitization-like processes. Not strictly habituation and sensitization, but it's like those processes. So let's take a look at first a kind of textbook example, and then we'll apply it to the rom-com, the structure of rom-coms. So this is the example from your textbook. We'll go over this as our intro. So here we have on the y-axis here your heart rate. And this line right here, that's your normal heart rate. That's kind of your resting heart rate. That's your heart rate right now sitting in this class. Higher on this, we have increased heart rate. Lower on this, we got decreased heart rate. And then this is time over here. What this study has done is they have shocked a person with an electrical shock and then measured their heart rate immediately after the shock. And what they find is that the heart rate initially increases as a result of the shock, and then this dark line is the heart rate, and then it decreases slightly until it reaches a elevated kind of stable plateau. And then once you turn the shock off, which is this dotted line here, you can see the shock off area, it then begins to decrease. Your heart rate once again begins to decrease, but it doesn't stop once it reaches that normal heart rate. It actually dips below and then takes a little bit of time to get back to where the original heart rate was. So this is the typical response to a stimulus such as a shock in terms of your heart rate. So you have normal heart rate, you get shocked, heart rate skyrockets, it then comes down a little bit, but it's still at an elevated level during the shock, when the shock is on. Once the shock is off, your heart rate starts to return to normal, but overshoots it, and then climbs back up rather slowly till it gets to the normal heart rate once again. So how can we explain this? Well, the opponent process theory of emotion, and it's really an opponent process theory of bodily processes, basically says that when your body reacts to something, it has mechanisms that try to bring you back to your normal state. It's called homeostasis. It's basically your body's process to try to bring you back to where you were. So if you're cold, you start shivering to try to raise your body temperature. If you're too warm, you start sweating to try to cool your body temperature. Your body is trying to get you back to that normal level. So what happens is that when you get shocked, your body has a reaction to the stimulus, and that's the A process. So the A process is your body's reaction to the stimulus, and that reaction in this case is to increase your heart rate. So this reaction is very quick. You can see that across very little time, your heart rate increases a lot. And this dotted line up here, this is your A process trying to increase your heart rate as a result of this shock. So that's the process in your body that's trying to increase your heart rate in this situation. When that is occurring, the B process, which is the kind of flip side process here, that also gets initiated by your body. That's your body trying to maintain your normal levels. That's your body trying to get you back to that homeostasis. So as soon as your heart rate goes up, your body starts this B process and says, you know what, let me try to bring that heart rate down. Let me start that B process, B process, B process. And this net result is the sum of your A process and your B process. So the A process is pulling you up, the B process is pulling you down. So you can see that we get the initial A process pulling us up, and then as the B process pulls it down, we go down. And then when the B process and the A process level off, we get this net result. And then the other thing about the B process is that it's not as fast as the A process. You can see that the A process has a very rapid reaction. The B process takes a little bit longer to get going. And then, importantly, it also lasts a little bit longer once the shock is turned off. So once the shock is turned off, the A process switches off very rapidly, but the B process is still going. And because your heart rate is a combination of your A process and your B process, the B process actually pulls your heart rate down once the A process is off, and then very slowly brings it back to normal. And that's why we have this reaction here where we have an increase in your heart rate, followed by a decrease before we get back to our normal level. So far so good? All right, so the last thing that's going to help us understand rom-coms, and that's important for this opponent process theory of emotion, is that through repeated presentations of this shock, if you went through shock training as part of, like, say, like some boot camp, if you were in the military, and you went through repeated shock training, what you would find is that eventually you would be able to very effectively deal with the shock. It wouldn't cause that much of an increase in your heart rate. And the reason for that is not because your A process has changed at all, right? So notice A process the first time, A process after, let's say, 20 trials of this, your A process has stayed the same. Your reaction to the shock has stayed the same. Your B process, on the other hand, has gotten a lot stronger. So through repeated training, through repeated trials, your B process increases its ability to counteract the A process. And this is why if you see somebody that's highly trained to deal with an aversive stimulus, it won't bother them as much. That's why if you are, let's say, for example, doing lifeguard training, they will have you run into cold water because they want you to go from this high reaction to cold water to this almost nothing reaction to cold water because you beefed up your B process. So importantly, your A process stays the same. Now your B process has become very strong. And what that means is that now when the shock is on, you get a very small increase in heart rate followed by, barely any increase in heart rate because the B process has become so strong. But now when you turn the shock off, your A process once again very quickly turns off. Your B process does not, takes a while to get back. And now we have a huge decrease in the heart rate following turning off of the shock. So that's the opponent process theory of emotion applied to the textbook example. Any questions on that before we go to the rom-coms? All right, off to the rom-coms. So to make sense of the romantic comedy kind of situation, we need to relabel these axes, this axis here. So we're going to have the kind of neutral, we're doing this in terms of emotion. So we got feelings of hate up there at the top of the y-axis. So this is when you're like, oh, I can't stand that person. They drive me crazy. This is feelings of love down here. This is when you're like, oh my gosh, they're the greatest in the world. I just want to be with them all the time. And then this is neutral right here, where they're like, well, what do you think of Dave? And you're like, he's okay. Right? That's neutral. You either no strong feelings one way or the other. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of take a look at the structure of what happens in that typical rom-com, starting off with girl meets boy. So we're going to do it from the point of view of the female in most of these. So it's girl meets boy, and this is for the first time. And typically, when girl meets boy for the first time, boy is doing something that girl does not like, right? So in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, they were going after, I think, the same journalistic story. You know, and she was trying to antagonize him. I can't remember the exact thing. It's been a while. But anyways, girl meets boy. Boy is doing something girl does not like. Boy is a stimulus that for some reason or another causes feelings of hate in the girl. So we have the stimulus being presented. Boy walks in, says something inappropriate, steals her cab, you know, bumps into her and knocks down all her papers, whatever it is. Boy meets girl, feelings of hate kind of launch, and she's like, ooh, you know, I can't stand that guy. That stays the entire time that he's there. So the entire time that he's there, the entire time that situation where they're interacting with each other, we have this feeling of hate until girl loses boy, and then all of a sudden that stimulus is gone, feelings of hate decrease, and she has maybe some feelings of liking. So girl loses boy for the first time, and right here is where she's thinking to herself, you know what? Maybe he wasn't so bad. And then she gets back to the point where she's like, I don't care either way. So, girl hates boy. After she meets him, he does something bad. Feelings of hate go away. Overshoot, maybe he's not such a bad guy after all. Goes back up to, doesn't think of him one way or the other. What's going on here is this is, again, that opponent process theory of emotion. So that thing that he did, that social breach of social contract, whatever it was that he did, that led to this A process, right? Where she was just angry at that boy, led to the A process. Feelings of hate was that A process. Your body does not like to feel. It's kind of weird to say. Your body doesn't really like to feel stuff, right? So if you're too angry, your body will try to calm you down. If you're too happy, your body will try to calm you down. Your body kind of likes, you know, mellow, normal levels of things. So as soon as you start feeling intense feelings of hate, your body says to itself, whoa, where's all this hate coming from? I don't want to feel this way. I like to feel mellow. So I'm going to start pumping out a little bit of anti-hate. I'm going to start pumping out a little bit of love. That's the B process. First time that they meet, not very strong, right? B process can't fight the A process. So the B process is not very strong. A process wins out. First time girl meets boy, we get the net result of girl hates boy. And then when girl loses boy, he leaves, he goes off, you know, to his little side story. Her hate for him decreases to the point where maybe later on when she's talking about him to her friend, she's like, oh, I can't believe what he did. You know, but he was kind of cute. Maybe he's not such a bad guy. You know what? Never mind. Back to normal. Don't think of him one way or another. That's the beginning of the movie. Why does this eventually lead to intense feelings of love, right? It's because of what happens to the B process. So if we look at girl meets boy or interacts with boy for the 20th time, right? So this is near the end of the movie. This is near the end of this rom-com. He might still be doing the behaviors that he was always doing before. He might still be that annoying individual. However, now when girl meets boy for the 20th time, that A process might still be kicking in, and kicking in pretty hard. But this time, there's a very strong B process, or A B process. There you go. There's a very strong B process that has kicked in because of this repeated exposure. The B process has gotten stronger. So now, when she is with him, she doesn't really feel much feelings of anger. She might be sitting there saying, you know what? I used to hate him a lot, but now he doesn't seem so bad. He's still kind of annoying. He still kind of gets on my nerves, right? Still a little bit of feelings of hate. But he's not as bad as he was before. He doesn't really seem that horrible. But notice that she's not in love with him yet, right? So when boy meets girl for that 20th time, doesn't hate him as much, but still not in love with him yet. Until girl loses boy for the 20th time. So he accepts that job in another city, right? He's moving on. He's going to be out of her life, and that is when all of a sudden girl loses boy, and the A process turns off, and this incredibly strong B process, which is slower to turn off, keeps going, and now all of a sudden this small little feeling of, well, he's kind of annoying, I don't really, he kind of gets on my nerves a little bit. All of a sudden it's like, you know what, he's not so bad, wait a second, what am I saying? I love him, I can't get enough of him, I want to be with him for the rest of my life. And this is when you jump into the cab and you rush off to the airport and you start trying to get through customs and, you get to the gate and you're like, don't go, don't leave, and they have the big kiss, and this is where the movie ends. If you ever want to find out what happens at the end of this, after it gets back to this thing, they actually made a movie called They Came Together, which kind of shows you what happens after the rom-com, because according to the A process, B process, this is where she basically has feelings of love for the individual, and this is where the movie ends. But there will eventually come a point where they're together and she's sort of like, it's not so great. So right about here is where the sequel would occur, and she's like, maybe I made a mistake, maybe he's not everything I thought he was, until he leaves again, and then the whole process occurs one more time. So you can see that it's cliche, but it might be cliche for a reason. It's actually something that could occur and does have psychological backing behind it. So on a more sort of, applicable note, because we're probably not in a rom-com, but on a more applicable note, the more you interact with somebody, even if they get on your nerves, the less you will react to it, the less feelings and emotions of them getting on your nerves will occur. And actually, when they're gone, you will have the opposite feeling for them more and more often. So this is just something to keep in mind. And this is something where, it's not a rom-com, but if you're ever dealing with somebody, maybe it's yourself, where they're in a relationship and they do nothing but argue all the time. I don't know if you know anybody like this. Every single time they're together, they're just arguing. But then, as soon as they're apart and you're talking to the person, you're like, why don't you break up with them? You're just arguing with them all the time. They're like, no, you don't understand. I love them. I can't live without them. And you're like, okay, well, they're here. And it's like, oh, I hate you so much. Why do you ever do that? And it's like, get out of my face. And then as soon as they leave, they're like, I missed them. I love them so much. You might look at that and say, that's just bizarre. That's weird. Not weird. Not weird at all. That's A process, B process. That's the opponent process theory of emotion. Because when they're together, whatever they're doing, they're not compatible. They shouldn't be together. That A process is kicking in, and they're angry at each other. As soon as they're apart, that B process is still going. They again have those feelings of love. So this is a possible way of explaining why two people just butt heads when they're together, but have such high feelings for each other when they're apart. It could be this A process, B process working on in their lives, because when they're not together, they're down in this B process phase here with all these massive feelings of love. So again, sometimes this bizarre behavior that we as humans do, that makes no objective sense, no logical sense, can actually be explained by just the simple application of some very, very basic types of learning processes. So any questions on that before we just kind of do a synopsis wrap up for this A process, B process? All right, so next time you watch a rom-com, try to apply the A process, B process to it, see if it kind of follows the pattern. But just to kind of end, I just wanted to mention, we mentioned before, it uses sensitization and habituation-like procedures. So it's not sensitization or habituation, but it's like those. So this A process is sensitization-like in the sense that it increases the response over repeated exposures. The B process here is habituation-like in the sense that it decreases your response over repeated presentation. So that's why it's included in this kind of section here. And again, very basic processes, very basic procedures, but as always, we'll try to apply them and explain these more complex types of human behavior. Any final questions, comments before we wrap up for the day? All right, so that is all that I wanted to cover for today.